Hello and welcome to Minter Dialogue, episode number 436. My name is Minter Dial and I'm your host for this podcast. This week's interview is with Dr. Margie Warrell. Margie has a PhD in the dynamics of power, gender and leadership. She's passionate about helping people to live bigger, braver lives. Host of the Live Brave podcast, Margie's the author of 5 best-selling books. You've Got This, Make Your Mark, Brave, Stop Playing Safe, and Find Your Courage. Margie's also an international speaker and member of the advisory board of Forbes School of Business and Technology. We discuss the importance of language, tackling the fear that holds us back, how fear shows up differently in different contexts, how to find your passion and purpose, how to instill courage in people, including your own kids, and much more. A most important conversation. You'll find all the show notes on minterdial.com. Please do consider to drop in your rating and review, and don't forget to subscribe to catch all the future episodes. Now for the show with Margie. Dr. Margie Warrell, what a pleasure to have you on. I think I found out about you, I think through Twitter, and your profile, all the books you've written, the mission you're on, and of course the latest book you have just written, or rewritten, I should say, made me feel like I had to have you on my show. Welcome on. How would you like to describe yourself, Margie?
Oh, I feel like I was a multi-hyphenate before that was a thing. So, big sister of 7, mum of 4. That's pretty central to me.
That's a football team. 7 and 4. You're already good.
Author, speaker, passionate advocate for women, Forbes columnist, podcaster myself, mountain climber, adventurer, lover of life, lifelong learner. I struggle sometimes to wrap it up quickly, but I think to just kind of encapsulate my passion is helping people live braver lives that make a bigger impact. And that's kind of what I'm all about.
It's brilliant because you and I are similar in age. And it's true that you kind of accumulate experiences and it gets a little bit more complicated to describe your life as you go on, hopefully, because you've filled it up, right? And yet, as you just did, you also described your mission, if you will, in the way you live your life, which at some levels is the synopsis, right? At least it's the synopsis of how you live your life.
Yeah, absolutely. Because, there's all the different hats that I wear, but what fuels me is just living a meaningful life that makes an impact, and in the way that draws on my own strengths, skills, talents, but also hard-won wisdom and all the struggles I've had along the way. So that's sort of what gets me out of bed and, fuels my energy and, makes me love life.
So in my second book, the first chapter is all about technologies, but the first chapter of this book, Future Proof, was entitled Meaningfulness. And I kind of feel that that's what it's all about. So I would love to ask you how you came to that mission, at what point in your life, and what was it that switched it on? Because I'm sure you didn't come out of the womb with it.
No, not at all. I kind of look back now and I see decades in a sense. So, my teen years was all about fitting in and trying to be popular. My 20s was very much about spreading my wings and exploring the world. I'd grown up on a small dairy farm in rural Australia, and I was just eager, hungry to go and explore the world. My 30s was very focused on mothering children while living around the world, but still, I was up to my neck in kids. I had 4 kids in 5 years, no multiples, same husband, across 3 continents. My 40s was really moving and like really making some traction professionally outside the home. But why do I feel so passionate around courage and bravery? Because I think the string that threads through all of my own life's experiences and what drives me is really overcoming the doubt and the fears in order to do, whatever it is that's been there for me at the time, whether that's been, backpacking around Africa, or that's been having 4 kids, or going off and starting a whole second career when I had 4 kids, 5 and under. So courage, I really believe, I think Aristotle said it, Churchill said it, courage is the first of all virtues because it's the one that guarantees all others. And so much of my work is around helping people to be more courageous, and to back themselves more and doubt themselves less. And it's because I've had to so many times despite that loud voice in my head going, who the hell do you think you are? You're just this relatively poorly educated girl from the Aussie bush, and
just with a PhD.
Yeah, well, that's fairly recent, but yes, that is. But for me, it was always overcoming, and it still is that little voice of doubt. That's who do you think you are, and what if you fail? And I honestly, as I travel around the world and met a lot of people, I meet so many people who I think are held back and who live in a restricted circle, to quote William James, of their full potential. And so I just love helping people get out of their own way.
So amongst those decades, to call them as you say it, when did the light bulb come on about your mission?
Yeah, so I was living in Papua New Guinea in my 20s, in my second half of my 20s. I'd newly married. And while living there, I met some awesome people, interesting people, sometimes very troubled people too. And I was struggling myself. I had an eating disorder all through my teens. I'd had bulimia and into my 20s, and it really flared up when I got to PNG, various obviously environmental triggers. It's a pretty intense place. It was pretty dangerous, still is.
Yeah, for sure.
And I found myself the confidant of many people, but I also found myself needing to do I had space to just do a lot of inner work and look at what had led me down this path of being in this fairly self-destructive relationship with food and my own body. At the same time, I did a 12-step program while I was there, but it was around eating versus alcohol. And I also then found myself in an armed robbery, and I had 3 miscarriages, the first at 20 weeks, just 10 days after that armed robbery. And all of those different things all it was this confluence that I decided to go back to university and study psychology. Like, why do smart, intelligent people act in such self-destructive ways at times? Myself, but also other people. I was meeting so many people that were doing things that were creating suffering for themselves. And so I went back in the wake of, losing my first baby, to do psychology. And I didn't know where it was going to lead. I honestly had no idea. I just felt called to go down a new path, and had more miscarriages, but ultimately over the course of 5 years had 4 healthy children. And but over the course of that period too, discovered the field of coaching, which is far more suited to my personality because it's much more sort of action oriented. And then I'd moved back to Australia, had a couple moves there, and then moved to the United States just after 9/11. And it was when I was in America, living in Dallas, Texas, God bless your heart. It was while living in Texas that I decided to start my own coaching business. And that was, my youngest is 18 years old and he was 6 months old. So 18 years ago, actually next month, I started this kind of coaching business, and that I had no idea what I was doing in terms of building a business. I just was extremely passionate about what I was doing. And courage came a few years later, kind of that convalesced around courage, because I decided to write a book. And I was like, well, what is it that I want to, that is going to be the core message of this book? Because there's, let's face it, 1,000,001 books, self-help books, and helping people be able to enjoy their lives more and suffer less. And I just got real clarity one day meditating that it was going to be around helping people have courage. So it was called Find Your Courage. And in a sense, it was me sort of stepping out and finding my own courage and defying those little voices that were saying, who do you think you are to write a book?
It's fascinating. I mean, Papua New Guinea, for me, it conjures images of the Second World War and the battles that happened in PNG for having studied that portion. So I kind of get a gist of what that was like living there, having a gun at your head. I've never had that happen. I've had a gun pointed at me, which is different, but still quite something. And then what I love about the way you describe it is that it's sort of a journey. It's not like, for me, it was the moment that I kind of retrospectively fit back the moment when the light switch happened. But it never is a singular moment, really. There's a sort of an accumulation of things. And all of a sudden you land in Dallas, Texas. You say, all right, I can be a coach. I can do this. And then courage comes into it, and you sort of layered it into your approach and what you do.
Yeah, so I moved to Texas. I had an 8-week-old baby, a 2-year-old and a 3-year-old, and I thought I'd landed on Mars.
Right.
And
that being Dallas, or is that
Dallas.
the 3 kids?
Yes. And, I was living in a suburb of Dallas, and it felt a little bit like I just stepped into the set of Stepford Wives or something. And it was just so different culturally. I mean, obviously, America, Australia, England, we all speak the same language, blah, blah, blah. But I did feel like I'd landed in a place that felt really foreign. I think if I'd moved to the DC area where I live now, it would have been less confronting that way, because I think there's a lot more international diversity here and political diversity. And so I just remember thinking, I just want someone to invite me over for a cup of tea or a glass of wine. And people invited me to Bible study or scrapbooking, which I'd never heard of until then. And I was like, oh, I just felt, and actually funny enough, all my friends were Brits. There was no Aussies that I got to meet, but I literally heard a woman's accent in a grocery store, and she was British. And I said, oh, you're from England? Honestly, I felt like we were cousins. I was like, oh, like she knows how to make a pot of tea, and we ended up becoming great friends. I think it's like we both sort of had this cultural connection, even though obviously Australia and England are still different, but there was this cultural connection that, but while I was there, yes, I decided, and it was about 2 years in before I launched that launched my little coaching business, coaching practice, to call it that. I didn't ever think of it as a business. I was just doing what I felt passionate about. And, it took a long while for it to take off and, make money. But I was never focused on optimizing income as much as I was about optimizing impact. And it's very much grown organically over 18 years. And of course, now, I've written 5 books, and I do a lot of speaking and a lot less coaching, but always sort of moving towards what I felt was interesting and gave me energy, and not doing the things that didn't give me energy, which probably meant I missed out on doing some things that commercially might have been really smart.
Right. This is that idea of saying no to things.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like when you're starting, of course, as an entrepreneur, it's like, yes, of course I can do that. So I wanted to ask you about book writing, for having written a few books myself. What have you learned about book writing, for having done these 5 bestsellers?
I've learned just start. Just start, because the actual process of writing gives clarity, and maybe you decide to change what you're saying because of the actual writing. But definitely don't wait until you are 100% sure you know what you're doing, and don't overwork your layout or your structure before you start. And I think for me, so I grew up, I went to a little school in rural Victoria, Australia, where I was the only kid in my grade all the way through primary school. And there was one teacher for the entire school. So, he was teaching 5-year-olds and he was teaching 12, 13-year-olds. And we were, so it wasn't like my early literary education was particularly strong. And then I went to a regional high school. And again, a lot of kids, it was sort of the goal was, can they be literate when you finish? So I certainly, and I never studied English. I mean, I did a business degree at university. I did a marketing degree. My dad thought it equipped me to work in a market. Couldn't understand why you needed 3 years for that. But I certainly was very aware of what I didn't know and the education I hadn't had. And I didn't feel, I listened to some people like J.K. Rowling or Elizabeth Gilbert, and they're just born to write. They just love writing. I never had that. I just felt my passion was around my message and what I wanted to say versus my ability to say it. And so, it was, I think, I'm trying to remember her name. She wrote Bird by Bird, and in Lamont, she said, just give yourself permission to write a shitty first draft. And that would be my biggest advice to anyone. Just give yourself permission to write a shitty first draft, and maybe your second will be slightly less shitty. And by your third or fourth, it will be okay. And I had to just let go any idea that I was going to write something that was ever going to be, some sort of masterpiece, but just write it. And not just, I wanted to avoid one day looking back and wondering, what if I'd tried?
Well, it seems, Margie, that is a little bit your general message, which is just do it.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is. And it's funny because that book was called Find Your Courage, but it was me finding my own courage to risk writing a really crappy book. And, I can look back on that book, which is now in 7 languages, I should add. I mean, I've never sold 1 million copies. It has been reprinted in multiple languages because the message in it is one that is so universal and timeless, and so many need to hear. And I think I've become a much better writer. My most recent book, You've Got This, is definitely a better written book. But even that book, I could pick up and look at any page, I reckon, and I could say, oh, I could have worded that sentence better. I could have made that stronger. Because I think we're always in a process of refining, and it's never going to be, well, certainly not for me. I don't think anything I've ever written, I could look at it and go, now that is perfection. Absolutely not. I always go, oh, I reckon that could be better. And I recently updated Stop Playing Safe, which I wrote a decade ago, and I rewrote it for the context of this pandemic time we're still weathering. And, I ultimately rewrote the book because my writing over the last decade has just got better and stronger, and my voice has become more authentic and more me. And so, yes, to anyone who's thinking about it, I would say, yeah, don't wait until you know what you're doing. Just start.
So you said something which struck me. I love picking up maybe out of context, because I'm kind of a decontextualizer at times, which is that just do it, but then also just stop it. And by which I mean stop, because you've got to at one point just let it go, even if it's not perfect. Otherwise you never finish the bugger.
Yeah. Pressing send on emails saying, yeah, I'm giving the final okay for that to go to print. There's always like, oh, thank God. Like, I just need, like, it's almost, and then, sure enough, anything afterwards, I look at it and go, oh, damn, I should have changed that. Or how did I miss that? But there comes a point where I'm like, I've just got to just move on. You can't spend your life being pregnant. You've just got to give birth to this thing. And I think the writing is like this whole gestation period. And then you've just got to say, okay, let's just get it out in the world. And I know that I'm going to see something. But I would also say, don't get pulled into comparisons. If I sat there and going, I have to write like one of the greats, then I would never write. I would never write because I'd spend my life in writing classes. And I meet people who do spend, they're like, oh, I'm going to do a writing course and another course. And I'm not saying you shouldn't do a course, but there comes a point where like, just stop doing courses and just write. And nothing, there's no better way to get better at any craft than actually doing it.
So that brings up, like this idea of I need to go to business school to become a better leader or maybe earn a better salary. Well, is that really true? And so maybe a little bit incisive, my question, but why did you feel the need to get a PhD?
Great question. I didn't feel the need to get a PhD. I actually had no need to get a PhD. I moved to Singapore. So 4 years ago, next week, actually, I'd been living in the US, moved back to Australia. My husband's former company said, oh, we will 100% be moving you back to the US. So we sent 2 kids to boarding school in America because we were following within 12 months. And then his company, who shall not be named, but I don't have anything good to say about them, said, oh, we've changed our mind. We want you to go to Singapore. And I was...
Oh, bloody hell.
Bloody hell is putting it gently. I can't even overstate. I just can't even overstate how upset I was about that, because I had kids in the US, and Singapore is actually the one place on the planet that's actually further from the US. And so we moved to Singapore, and a lot of people there have live-in helpers. And I'd done the hard yards with kids, and I was like, I've done it. I'm getting a live-in helper. And I realized that my 2 boys, I went there with them, they left for school at 6:30 in the morning, didn't get home till 7 at night. And I had a live-in helper who did everything. And while I traveled a lot with work, doing a lot of keynote speaking, I realized, I've got like 20 freaking hours in the week that I didn't have before, if not more. And I went out for coffee with some woman I met who I never met again. And she said, well, have you considered doing a PhD? And I said, I don't even have a master's. Like, I'd never even got I got an undergrad, I got a bachelor's degree when I was 20, I finished when I was 21. And now I was in my 40s. And she said, oh, there's this university where if you've got, decades experience, they accept people. And so I literally went back home that afternoon, signed up, did an interview. And next thing you know, I was in a PhD program. And me being me, I just dived in and just got right into it, even though I was, not that grades matter in PhD, but I'm sure I would not have graduated with, I didn't try and do it perfectly. I just dived in. I knew what I was interested in studying, which was around gender power and leadership. And so, I got my master's on the way to the PhD and got it all done in 3.5 years, which most people don't do. But it was really a way of going, you know what, that would be a useful thing to do with all the extra time I have on my hands versus I need to prove to the world that I'm smart or something.
Right. Well, I resonate with that. The idea of exploring, researching, learning, and doing something, and the fact that it ends up with a doctorate seems interesting to me. So women's studies is something, as I mentioned to you before we started a hit record button, it's something that I studied. And I feel like, obviously, since my time in the 1980s, the whole subject has moved on. I mean, it's no longer women's studies, it's gender studies. And yet I feel like there's some immutables. And so I might be considered rearguard at this point. But somehow I have this generalization that, and please don't take it wrong, that women understand imperfection better than men.
I believe that women's relationship with perfection is more embroiled in gender norms and pressures than men's. My experience is that women wrangle far more often with the need to feel like they have to be perfect and struggle more with just lowering the bar. I feel men are far better at going, this is good. Let's move on. And maybe that's my experience in the corporate realm. I do a lot of work with companies, but men will put their hand up and go for a job when they're not quite sure if they've got even tick 3 of the 10 boxes, but they'll go, look, I'll figure it out. And research shows that men tend to judge themselves less harshly when they do mess up. And women tend to be far tougher on themselves and much more inclined to focus in on what they didn't totally nail or where they're not a complete master. And so I think there are absolutely gender differences between, obviously between men and women when it comes to perfection. But I think that I know myself, I think I struggle more with not doing things brilliantly than my husband does.
And I think
And
that
I
the
see
interest,
that play out a lot.
I've multiple times said the same story of how, all right, so who can do this? And the five men in the room raise up their hand. Of course I can. I can do it. Your bravado, which you mentioned multiple times in your book. And no women of the five women, none of the five women raise up their hands. And then one of the men says, look around, but hey, to one of the women, didn't you do this before? I've done it 5 times, but I could still do better.
Or I've never done it in this context.
Right, for example, whatever. But there's this like justification. So, and the fact is, in the professional world, that's the way it rolls. And I think the paradigm is complicated. And then of course there's also inter women, how they manage each other and so on and so forth. Yet I feel, because what's important actually is the real world. That is, how we live our lives, a part of which is how we work and earn our living. And it's in that context that I subscribe to the idea that women have a better relationship with imperfection than men do. Because the idea of vulnerability about which you talk, which is the thing that strong men need to get a grip on, is actually a life story, not a work story.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's so many terms that we're familiar with now that I'd never heard of 10 years ago. And whether it's toxic masculinity or the man box, all of these terms that have been coined as we become more aware of how much it's not just women who are stifled by gender norms. Men are stifled by gender norms too. And I strongly oppose railing at men. I meet some women who do, they're just trying to keep us down, etc. Because I know lots of great men and they're shaped by their environment just as we women are shaped by our environment and history and how we were parented, etc. And so I absolutely think many men, really the absolute shame trigger for men is around appearing weak. They feel the need to be strong and they have to be strong. And women sometimes put a lot of pressure on men to be strong too. In fact, a lot of men, the research shows, like the last person they're willing to be vulnerable with can be their wife because they feel they have to be strong for their wife. And I think that's a huge issue, and it's something that I think causes enormous suffering for men. But of course, many have a difficult time expressing their emotions, and they get pushed down and put on there. And I mean, obviously, you're British. You think culturally, we're not here to be.
Damn it.
Yep, stiff upper lip, and obviously, I grew up in Australia, and that's very prevalent there too.
Sure.
And I think so. And I think, men and women are just naturally different. I think how we process emotions is just naturally different. And that's not a bad thing. It's just different. And I think we need both men and women we're at our best diversity, as always. The best always comes from diversity. But I think it's so important to create environments where men can be authentic and real and expressive and not feel that they have to put on a mask of toughness for their own sake and for actually the lives that they impact.
So I have a little story. When I was, I remember running the company and I had to do a press conference, and there were 60 people invited, all the la-di-das, all the big titles. And for whatever reason, with all the stress that was involved, I actually broke down and started to cry in front of everybody, almost at the beginning of the event. And this had never happened. Goodly gosh, I So I was all over the, oh, I'm so embarrassed. I'm so sorry. And I kind of expected everybody to get up and leave at that point. I was like, this is just not happening. This is, oh my gosh. And at the end of the event, what was fairly illuminating for me was actually some people stayed. There were some people clapping to get me back in, and as one does, because actually the people have empathy and they understand that there are stresses. And the most important person in the room, as far as I was concerned for the event, came up to me and said, may I hug you? And I said, oh my gosh, this is pretty cool. And so what I realized was that they didn't think less of me for crying. Somehow they felt more connected to me because it showed that I wasn't some sort of, superficial, everything's perfect, rah leader. I wasn't able, I just did, But the point that I wanted to get to was this, and somehow it's usually easier when a woman says it, embracing our differences. Yet I feel like it's okay only to talk about our differences if they're better. So it's, diversity, we talk about that. And you bring on a team of diversity, but actually I feel like we're usually constrained, especially when you're in a position of power, to mention the positives of the diverse or the differences that we have, rather than identify or accept somehow that we have differences where sometimes not always better. And sometimes that strength of courage that you mentioned sometimes is necessary. The vulnerability sometimes is necessary. Emotions, you can cry sometimes, but not all the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, none of us are strong at everything. Certainly not strong at everything all the time. And I would say, yes, to your point, it's not always better, it's just different. So I am not great with details. I don't like details. I'm not great with details. I'm not into process and all of that. And other people are. And we need people who are really into details, because I just love being at the big picture. And that's awesome. And I bring something to the table, but goodness knows if everyone was like me, we'd be in trouble. I'm not someone highly analytical that's going to sit there studying numbers. I just think of so many things I'm not good at and other people are great at. And I love when I meet people who love doing things that I couldn't think of anything worse than doing. I'm like, I am so glad that you love coding or whatever, because not my gig. And likewise, it's funny, I have a friend, she's a coach, and I have been running, and I've had a bit of a sabbatical over the pandemic, Live Great Women's Weekends. And I have a friend who's a coach, and she came and she said, let me just support you at your weekend. I said, fantastic, great. And at the end of it, she goes, I just love that you just love being at the front of a room and facilitating a big group of women for a weekend. She said, but I couldn't think of anything worse, but I would just love to work one-on-one with women. And I'm like, yeah, great, because I couldn't think of anything worse than just being one-on-one all the time, occasionally, but not all the time. So I just think how wonderful that we have people who are different than us, and what a gift that is, versus making those comparisons. And I'm sure you've heard that phrase, comparison is the thief of joy. I also think it's such an impediment to progress, to ourselves, our own, and collectively. Just avoid it.
Yeah. So in the realm of, let's say, this idea of accepting diversity and different opinions, it was funny that when I studied women's studies at Yale, we studied Black history, we studied gays, we studied all versions of different diversity under the banner of women's studies. Had it been called male studies, it would have been called history, English.
Yeah.
And somehow I feel like my narrative, the little story in Minter's mind, is that women embrace this diversity. And I feel, and I certainly don't want to make it like it's equal to, this notion of also accepting that we're different and our imperfections that come with it, because by golly, we're not perfect. We do have strengths, and within our differences, we also have lesser strengths or weaknesses, to call them by another word.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we know that. I mean, there's obviously the traditional gender traits, feminine leadership traits, behavioral traits, male behavioral traits, men, which of course are always generalization. Women are more communal, men are more competitive, blah, blah, blah. We've heard all of that. And I think, again, it's not better than, worse than, it's just different too. And to me, the empowerment of women and the elevation of women, and I feel really strongly about empowering, a lot of my work around empowering more women to sit at decision-making tables and to get out of their own way. But it's not so that women can be more powerful than men. It's actually that we can be equal players and equal partners. And I mean, and that's obviously, there's many different types of diversity. I'm talking about gender diversity. There's many different types of diversity, but and I think that's what makes a great partnership, when people like, what do I bring to the table? Well, let's celebrate what you bring. Let's figure out how to create as much synergy here as we can and to serve everybody.
Totally. So in the last section, I would like to talk a lot about fear. You write a lot about it. And so obviously I've studied a bit about it, and I've seen all the different ways we characterize fear. But I was wondering, in the ways that we characterize fear of abandonment, of humiliation, or whatever it is, death, are there different ways that as men and women we approach fear? Is there some research that shows that we actually, our brains are wired towards fear in different ways? Is there some, can you give us a little bit of understanding of that?
Yeah, no. So, I mean, obviously no one is immune to fear. Fear serves a really important role, but in how we process our perception. So fear it comes from our perception of perceived danger or threat to our well-being or the well-being of those around us. And so how we interpret and process that differs across gender and in our decision-making processes. So women tend to be more considered and more cautious of taking risks where they could risk putting well-being, putting reputation, putting money on the line. Men are more willing generally to take risks. And we see that obviously guys tend to love more adrenaline fueling activities than women. And part of that is because there's a desire for just the adrenaline rush of going fast in fast cars, or going skydiving or whatever. But part of it is in the calculation. What's the risk versus the benefit? Men are going to go, well, that's worth it. I know there's a risk I might, die jumping out of a plane, but man, it is going to be so much fun. I'm going to love it. Whereas women might go, you know what? It could be fun, but it's not that much fun. I'm not willing to risk it. And so there's a difference in that perception of the ratio of risk to benefit, to payoff. But also women tend to be more considered decision makers. So they tend to hold back, not dive in as quickly. That can work both ways.
Sure.
At times, that bravado isn't all bad. There's good things can happen from someone saying, what the hell, I'm taking the leap, diving in, let's just figure this out as we go and, learn to fly the plane as we build it. And women obviously are more likely to say, you know what, why don't we just step back and think this through a little bit more? And so there's a balance there.
I have to use a single word to describe the difference, and that is the level of responsibility. I feel like women look at a broader picture, and I'm responsible for a family, and therefore I can't jump out of this airplane. It's the more responsible thing to do.
I would say yes, but I would also push back yes and say from men there can be, when it comes to say jumping out of an airplane or going hang gliding or something, the perceived reward from that is just much, much higher. Women just have less desire to jump out of an airplane, like just just don't want to do it as much. Now, I mean, obviously that is a generalization. I jumped out of it. By the way, I've jumped out of an airplane.
You've climbed Kilimanjaro. So you've done crazy
I've done
things.
these things. I've climbed Kilimanjaro, I've climbed numerous mountains, and I've done lots of things that plenty of people might say are risky. But
me included,
I have less,
by the way.
but I have less appetite for it than I think overall than some men. And that I just think that's how our brains are wired. And when it comes to responsibility, I'm always very hesitant to kind of say, wow, women are more responsible than men. Maybe we're sometimes more cautious and timid too.
Well, you do say in your book, that, or at least you quote somebody else saying, I paraphrase, but basically, what we need to do is educate women, girls.
Yes, I absolutely think we have to embolden women to be braver and to take risks. And because women tend to, one, overestimate the risks, underestimate themselves more, like their ability to handle risks. And so empowering women to go, you know what, you can try this. And if it doesn't work out, you will figure it out. Men have generally more confidence in their ability to figure it out. And if you look at the research around how we raise kids, on a playground, parents are more likely, if there's monkey bars, they're more likely to say to their little 4-year-old, oh, be careful, but let me give you a leg up. But be careful, but I'll give you a leg up. And say to their daughter, oh, it's a bit dangerous. Why don't you go and play over there on the, swing? So we parent differently when it comes to encouraging risk-taking behavior. Likewise, it's like we treat our daughters' bones as though they're more fragile than our boys' bones.
Well, I mean, then inculcated or not, should we be doing the same to both? Because I mean, at some level, if little Jimmy is a go-getter, happy to jump off cliffs into water, hopefully. Oh, Jimmy, hold back. And Jemima, well, go for it. Or should we treat them the same way?
Honestly, every child is different. I have 4 kids, right? And some of them they're all extroverts, but one of them in particular is like a little mini Bear Grylls meets Richard Branson, sort of just fearless. And at times I've had to just say, let's just stop and think through here. And he's 18 now, so he's not stupid. Whereas some of the others I've had to kind of push and say, why don't you try skydiving? And they're like, oh, I don't know. I'm like, no, it'd be really good for you. And they've gone and done it, but they've needed the push. The other one's like, oh, I'll do it. And so I think how we parent our kids, regardless of gender, has to be different because our kids are different. And I don't think a blanket, there's no one size fits all. I absolutely feel passionately around teaching our kids to be smart about taking risks and to be embracing of the risk of failure and to say, hey, try out for it. Well, I don't know if I'm going to make the top team. Just try out for the top team. I mean, what's the worst thing that can happen? You don't get in, you make the B team, or the worst, maybe C team, or you don't make any team, but at least you've tried. And that building that resilience, you are not defined by your results. And I see way too many parents, like you can tell this is a hot topic, who, are so worried about their kids feeling disappointed or rejected and then going in and complaining when they don't make the top team. And I'm like, not everyone can win. Kids need to learn. The best thing we can do for our kids is teaching them how to handle failure.
Yeah, so when I look at fear, there's always the fear of failure and of humiliation or so on and so forth. I tend to put above all our fear of death as a uniting concept that everybody has to face. And I feel like that is a true difficulty. And I would love for you to tell me how this might have been part of the rewriting of Stop the Fear. For what's it called? Sorry, you're
this book, Stop Playing Safe.
Stop Playing Safe. How the just somebody to finish. How the idea of the fear of death, pandemic included, and a lesser idea of educating around resilience and failing has contributed, or was that part of that book? Because I didn't get to read that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So this pandemic has magnified our sensitivity to perceive danger to our physical well-being from a virus, right? Like for legitimate reasons, because many people have died. So it's not to deny legitimate risks and legitimate dangers, but what our brains tend to do is we tend to then project that onto everything, and people have become just hyper cautious. Many people, not all people, but fear is a very contagious emotion, and left unchecked, it can overtake our thinking and undermine our decision making. And I believe that there are people who live their lives constantly in fear. Everything is to be feared. Every risk is to be avoided, and not all risks are created equal. And I have seen people, by the way, I should just mention, like my husband got COVID, my kids have had COVID. My husband was actually hospitalized with COVID. I was living in Singapore at the time, March last year. He's made 100% recovery. But, there's a lot of fear mongering that has also gone on. And while it's not that we should be it could be reckless or stupid, I think we have to be careful not to become so risk averse, not to be living so safely that we miss out on life itself. And I see people pre-pandemic who lived so anxiously, so timidly, so safely that I was like, what, your life is just so vanilla. It's so living in such a small little circle of what's comfortable and familiar that you're missing out on actually tasting and diving deep into what life's about, to trying new things, going new places, meeting new people. It's the same because everything's scary. And so it's why I truly believe that risk is part and parcel. We need to learn how to take risks. And I can't recall who said it, but, well, actually, maybe it was Helen Keller, that, security is superstition. And when we just try and avoid things that make us feel insecure, we ultimately become less secure. That only by being willing to go out there and take risks and expose ourselves to the things we fear, can we ultimately build our capacity and our sense of security in our lives. Now, that's not to say doing stupid things, but it is to say, don't try and avoid all risks. Don't try and risk rejection. Don't try and risk, the chance that you might end up in a place that you don't like. Go out there. I mean, I remember backpacking around the world for a year as a 21-year-old and landing in numerous places that I, go, all right, well, I got out of the train in the wrong place in Manhattan and I ended up in Harlem and whatever. So I got back on the train and went back a few stops. And, some people had someone say to me, oh, that was such a ridiculously dangerous thing for you to go traveling around on your own. I'm like, yeah, but I learned a lot. And I actually never found, nothing bad actually happened.
Well, and I mean, and maybe it could have, but that's also life. And do you feel like there's a risk management muscle that, for having done so many things, you've sort of accumulated some, not sort of thicker skin, but a thicker risk management component?
Yes, I think my ability to discern risks. So there's, what's the chance of it happening, and what are the stakes if it did? And so, if there's something is really low probability, but if that thing happened, it would just be devastating. Well, I don't want to risk it. But if the chance of it happening, and if it did happen, it's like, it's really not massive. Well, then, you know what? Give it a go. Like, what's the worst thing that could happen? It's not, the worst thing that could happen is not that bad. You got up on stage and gave a speech and, it didn't land so great. You didn't die. The world, you didn't fall, the ground didn't open up beneath you. And sometimes people, you said fear death, fear of public speaking, right. Like, you're not going to die.
Well, that is an interesting lever, the probability of it happening and the intensity of the consequence. And as I said before, I feel like I believe that the fear of death is the one above all, because it sounds like the biggest consequence there could be. Actually,
but I also think what we often do, and this is part of it, is we don't get afraid of what will happen if I don't do it. And so writing that first book, I was really afraid I was going to completely humiliate myself if this book came out and people said it was terrible. In fact, I had a nightmare just before it came out, and my face was on the front page of the New York Times, and it was the byline, world's worst author. And let's face it, that was never going to happen. I mean, that would have been great publicity, but that was never going to happen. But what I think we often do is we discount the cost of inaction. We discount the cost of caution and playing safe. And it's why at the end of life, people regret far more the risks that they didn't take, because fear of what might happen sat in the driver's seat. And so don't just ask yourself, well, what is it that might happen if I do this? Ask yourself, how will I feel 1 year, 5 years, 10 years from now if I don't do it? If I don't invite this person out, go on the date, change jobs, put myself out there. And we're really good at imagining how we'll feel a day, a week from now if we try and we fail, but we're usually pretty poor at putting ourselves in the shoes of the future us and asking, well, how will I feel 10 years from now if I don't?
So last question for you, Margie. I have tended to focus on who we want to be as a guiding principle, a North Star. It feels like you focus more on what we should do. How does that break down in Margie's head?
No, I actually agree. I think it's about who do you want to be, and then what do you need to do to become that person? So to me, it really does start with who do you want to be? And I think of a funny quote by Lily Tomlin. She said, I always wanted to be somebody. I should have been more specific. And I often say to people, who do you want to be in the world? And who do you want to be for the people you care about? You know, what do you want to make? You know, Gandhi said, my life is my message. You know, who do you want to be in this one and only precious adventure that sometimes messy we call life? And then what do you need to do to be that? And the answer to that is you will always need to be brave. Whoever you want to be, you need to be brave.
I love it. I love the Lily Tomlin quote. I will have to borrow that one, as I feel like so many people think they know who they are, but they don't actually have a precise version of it. And so we all want to be happy, wealthy, healthy, but that's just not good enough. It's not precise enough. And you end up being frustrated because you want to be like everybody else ultimately, as opposed to be the best version of you. Fabulous, Margie. Good Lord. I wrote down actually 20 other questions, didn't even bloody get to them as I expected. Margie, so you got your second edition of a book you wrote 10 years ago. Tell us how people can find you, your books, and any other action you would like people who are listening to take.
Oh, thank you. Well, honestly, the best place is to go over to my website, margiewarrell.com, and you'll find links to buy all my books on my website. But they're all anywhere you buy books, Amazon, anywhere, you can buy all of my books there. I also invite people to sign up for my Live Bravely newsletter and to connect with me on wherever they are on social media, LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or wherever, but I'm all just under my name, Margie Warrell.
Lovely. And probably in multiple languages, all the books. So beautiful. Thank you so much, Margie, for coming on the show and exchanging with me. Hopefully one day we'll have a chance to cheers some kind of beer and continue the conversation.
That would be awesome. Be well.
Thanks for having listened to this recording of the Minter Dialogue Show. You'll find the show notes and other blog posts on minterdial.com. If you enjoyed the show, please head over to iTunes to give a rating and review. And to finish, here's a song I wrote with Stephanie Singer, A Convinced Man.
Stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger to won't toe the line. I sit here passively, hope for your respect, anticipating a thrill of your intellect. Maybe I tell myself there's no use in me lying. I'm a convinced man building an urge. I'm a convinced man to live and die submerged. A convinced man in the arms of a woman. I'm a convinced man, challenge my fate. I'm a convinced man, competition's innate. A convinced man in the arms of a woman. Despise revenges and struggle to see. Live for the challenge so life's not incomplete. What's wrong with challenge? I know soon we all die. I like the feel of a stranger tucked around me, precipitating the danger to feel free. Trust in my reason and let me show you why. I'm a convinced man practicing my lines. I'm a